Want to tell you about a room. Not a famous room, not a throne room or a war room or the kind of room where history gets decided by people who know they're deciding history. This was a waiting room. Specifically, it was waiting hall 7C in the outer processing annex of the Galactic Hegemony's primary refugee intake station. Stationed at coordinates most beings never had reason to know, orbiting a brown dwarf that didn't even have a proper name. Just a catalog number, KD 7714, a dim reddish smudge in the sky that never quite managed to become a star. It was, by nearly all accounts, the worst room in the known galaxy. The chairs were the wrong shape for most species. The lighting was calibrated for Varesi physiology, which meant it was too blue for humans, too bright for the Sethali, and gave the Druvani migraines severe enough that 3 of them had filed formal complaints with the Hegemony Medical Bureau. The complaints were still pending. The Druvani were still there, sitting in corners with their membrane flaps pressed down over their sensory clusters, enduring. The smell was a problem too, with 47 known sapient species cycling through on any given day, and the environmental processors running at 60% efficiency because someone in maintenance had filed the wrong replacement part order 6 years ago and nobody had corrected it. The air in waiting hall 7C had developed its own personality. It wasn't quite bad, exactly. It was more like the air had given up trying to be good. My name is Torven Seath. I was, at the time this story begins, a junior processing clerk for the Hegemony Refugee Assessment Division. I had been assigned to waiting hall 7C for 14 months. I had another 8 months on my rotation before I could apply for a transfer. I was counting days. I am telling you this so you understand. I was not someone who was looking for anything. I was someone who had stopped looking for things a long time ago because in waiting hall 7C, things didn't get better. They just got processed. And then the humans arrived. Not all at once. That's important to say. It wasn't like they came in a fleet or made some dramatic entrance. The first one I ever saw was a woman, and I had to look her species up, because at that point in my career I had processed exactly 0 humans, who walked into the hall on a Tuesday, carrying a bag that was too heavy for her and was clearly not going to admit that. She had dark hair, brown skin, and eyes that moved around the room in that particular way that beings do when they're trying to look calm while not being calm at all. She walked to the intake desk. I was the intake desk. She put her documents on the counter. They were physical documents, which was unusual. Most beings had their identification encoded in biometric chips or neural link data pads. She had paper, actual paper. I picked them up and they felt strange in my hands, thinner and more fragile than anything I usually handled. The documents were from something called the United Earth Diplomatic Mission. The stamp was in 3 scripts I didn't recognize. The species designation field read, Human, Homo sapiens, Origin, Earth, Sol System, Local Spur, Orion Arm. I processed her documentation. I asked the standard questions. Her name was Amara Osai. She was a diplomatic attaché. She was applying for observer status at the upcoming Hegemony Council session. I stamped her forms and told her to take a seat. She thanked me sincerely. Not the perfunctory acknowledgement that most beings gave intake clerks, because most beings treated intake clerks the way they treated furniture, but an actual, direct, eye contact thank you that caught me so off guard I almost forgot to give her the queue number. She went and sat in one of the wrong-shaped chairs and pulled out a small notebook and started writing in it with a physical pen, and I watched her for a moment before I caught myself watching and looked away. That was the beginning. What nobody tells you about the Hegemony, and I say this as someone who spent 11 years working inside it, is that it's not malicious. That's the thing that's hardest to explain to people who weren't there. The Hegemony didn't turn away the humans because it hated them or feared them or thought they were inferior. It turned them away because it had procedures. The procedures existed for good reasons. Mostly. There were application requirements, documentation thresholds, species classification protocols that had been developed over 400 years of managing the administrative complexity of 47 sapient civilizations. To add a new species to the registry was not a small thing. It required bioethical assessment, cultural compatibility review, diplomatic history verification, technological capability evaluation, and 17 other sub-processes that I could list but won't, because even I found them tedious and I was paid to care about them. The humans had applied. They had applied 11 times. I found this out later, much later, when I went through the archived records. The first application had been submitted 43 years ago by something called the United Earth Government, which had since been reorganized twice but maintained consistent diplomatic succession. Each application had been received, acknowledged, reviewed, and declined. The reasons varied. Insufficient diplomatic history. Earth had only been spacefaring for 60 years at that point. Incomplete bioethical documentation. Their initial submission had accidentally omitted the required section on reproductive ethics, a mistake any new applicant might make. Species classification pending review. The Hegemony's Xenobiology Division had flagged humans as requiring extended study because their psychological profile was, quote, statistically anomalous in several indices. Application submitted during administrative freeze. The freeze lasted 9 years. Failure to obtain species sponsor certification. To get species sponsor certification, you needed a hegemony member species to vouch for you. To get a hegemony member species to vouch for you, you generally needed relationships developed over decades of diplomatic contact. To develop those relationships, it helped to have observer status, which required species sponsor certification. The hegemony had never officially noticed this circle. Documentation submitted in non-standard format. Earth had submitted in English, Mandarin, and Spanish, which were not recognized hegemony scripts. They had not been informed that hegemony common script was required. The notification of rejection had been sent in hegemony common script. I could go on. There were 11 rejections. Each one sent a diplomatic response team back to Earth with a polite letter and a new checklist. Each time, Earth corrected the issues and reapplied. Each time, something new was found to be insufficient. I don't think anyone in the hegemony meant for this to happen. I really don't. I think the system just had gaps, procedural cracks that a new species could fall into and keep falling, because nobody whose job it was to notice these things was looking at the full picture. Everyone was looking at their own piece. The Xenobiology Division had flagged humans as anomalous and passed them along. The Diplomatic Review Office had noted the insufficient sponsor certification and passed them along. The Documentation Processing Unit had returned the non-standard forms and passed them along. Nobody was looking at the shape of the whole thing. Amara Osai was looking at the shape of the whole thing, but I didn't know that yet. The second human I processed was a man named Kweku Asant, and he came in 3 days after Amara. He was taller, quieter, and he had a stillness about him that reminded me of the Vethali monks I occasionally saw in the hall. Beings who had trained themselves into a kind of deliberate calm that looked like peace, but was actually, if you paid attention, something much more focused. He placed his documents on the counter. Diplomatic mission? I asked, because his documents were from the same organization. Liaison team, he said. We're here with Attaché Osai. I processed his forms. His designation was Cultural Liaison, First Class. I gave him his queue number. He took it. The wait time, he said, not really as a question. Is it usually this long? I told him the current wait for Observer Status Preliminary Review was approximately 14 hegemony standard days. He nodded slowly, and there's no way to expedite. I explained the expedite protocols. They required a sponsoring species representative to file a priority request. He asked if there were any sponsoring species here currently. I checked the board. There were not. Thank you, he said. He went and sat near Amara. She looked up when he arrived, and they had a brief exchange that I couldn't hear, and she showed him something in her notebook, and he looked at it for a moment, and then they both looked at the board with the queue numbers, and then they looked at the ceiling, which was what you did in Waiting Hall 7C when you were absorbing difficult news, because the ceiling at least didn't have a queue board. The ceiling was a neutral beige. It was the best thing about the room. By the end of that first week, there were 9 humans in Waiting Hall 7C. They had come in quietly, in 2s and 3s, always with documents from the United Earth Diplomatic Mission, always with the same polite, slightly too careful manner of people who had been told to be on their best behavior and were taking that seriously. They ranged in what I was learning to recognize as typical human variation, different heights, different colorings, different builds. One of them, a man named Petrov, was so large that the waiting chairs were visibly uncomfortable for him, but he sat in them anyway and didn't complain. One of them, a young woman named Yim, had hair the color of autumn leaves on worlds I'd only seen in datavids, and she was always doing something with her hands, sketching, folding small paper shapes, occasionally dismantling and reassembling a small mechanical device that seemed to serve no purpose except to be taken apart and put back together. I watched them between processing other applicants. It wasn't professional of me, but waiting hall 7C was slow, and they were interesting, and I had been there for 14 months, and I had stopped finding most things interesting a long time ago. What struck me first was how they behaved with each other. There was a kind of, I want to say competence, but that's not quite the right word. It was more like they had worked out, without needing to discuss it, how to occupy the difficult space of the waiting room without making it worse. They took turns standing so others could stretch. They shared food, which was not common behavior in multi-species waiting rooms, where most beings were cautious about interspecies contamination of their food supply, but the humans seemed to extend the offer reflexively, to each other, and occasionally to the beings sitting near them. One of them, an older man named Hassan, had apparently brought more food than he needed, and distributed the excess to two young Sethali who were showing the particular stillness of beings who were very hungry and too proud to say so. The Sethali, after a moment of apparent shock, accepted. I saw this from my desk. I made a note of it in my observation log, which I kept for my own purposes and which was not, technically, a required part of my job. The second week was when things started to become complicated. Amara Os had apparently been using her time in the waiting room the way a military strategist uses a map, not passively, but with an agenda. I know this in retrospect. At the time, I just noticed that she seemed to know everyone in the hall by name by the third day, including a Druvani elder named Vesharkai who had been waiting for 61 days for a resolution to his family's resettlement claim, and who had, by all observable evidence, stopped expecting resolution. She was sitting with Vesharkai on the 12th day, when I noticed that something had changed about the Druvani elder. He was still sitting with his membrane flaps pressed down because the lighting was still wrong for him, but he was talking. The Druvani are not naturally communicative species under stress. They pull inward, but Vesharkai was talking, and Amara was listening with the kind of attention that made other people visible to themselves, and at some point she wrote something in her notebook, tore out the page carefully, and handed it to him. I found out later that she had written down the exact citation for a hegemony regulation that entitled Druvani resettlement applicants to automatic lighting adjustment in any processing facility, a right that existed on paper and had simply never been enforced in Waiting Hall 7C because no one had ever asked. Vesharkai took the page. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at Amara. Then he went to my desk. I had to look up the regulation. It took me 11 minutes, which was embarrassing because I should have known it. But I didn't, because Druvani applicants had never asked before, and in Waiting Hall 7C, you learned what you needed to know by being asked it. I adjusted the lighting in the section where the Druvani were sitting. It took me 4 minutes to do the override. The section shifted from blue-white to a warmer amber spectrum. Vesharkai stood very still for a moment, and then, I have never forgotten this, he lifted his membrane flaps. Slowly, like a being who had been bracing against something painful and was testing whether the pain had really stopped. He looked at me from across the room. His sensory clusters were sensitive, wide open, undefended. He inclined his head. I inclined mine back. Later that day, I updated the facility's standard operating procedures to include automatic lighting assessment for all non-standard species at intake. It took me 20 minutes, and some mild violations of my job scope that my supervisor never noticed. I felt, for the first time in 14 months, that I had done something that mattered. I'm not telling you this to make myself look good. I'm telling you because I want you to understand how the humans worked. Not with speeches, not with demands, with very small, very specific actions that had been thought through carefully and that produced ripple effects. Part 2, the channel. On the 17th day of the humans' stay in Waiting Hall 7C, the thing happened that I am really writing this document to tell you about. But before I can tell you about it properly, I need to tell you about the relay buoy. Somewhere between the Keith Ronnie Drift and what used to be called the Outer Silence, a stretch of space that the major shipping lanes had bypassed since a navigational rerouting about 200 years ago. There floated a piece of human technology. It was small. It was old by human standards, and it had been sending a signal for a very long time into a section of space where no one with a receiver had been paying attention. The signal was a broadcast, a channel, a continuous stream of data that had been launched as part of something the humans called the Deep Sky Communications Initiative about 40 years ago, when Earth was still in its early expansion period, and was sending out signals the way young civilizations often do, hopefully indiscriminately into the dark, not really expecting anything to hear, but needing to say we are here anyway. The channel broadcast in a rotating sequence of content. Most of it was what you might expect: information about Earth, about human biology, about human history and culture and language. But the humans had also included something that, as far as I know, no other species had ever thought to include in a first contact transmission. They had included documentary footage of themselves being ordinary. Not their best moments, not their diplomatic triumphs or their scientific achievements or their military victories, ordinary life. A morning market in a city called Nairobi, a fishing village in a place called Vietnam, a child learning to ride a bicycle on a street somewhere in Brazil, old men playing chess in a park, a group of teenagers arguing about music, a family making dinner, a woman repairing an engine in a garage, narrating what she was doing to someone off camera, and occasionally swearing when a part didn't fit, and then laughing at herself. The channel had been floating out there for 40 years, and nobody had been watching it. Until the day a hegemony survey vessel doing a routine drift mapping exercise near the Keith Ronnie buoy zone picked up the signal, almost by accident, and a junior sensor operator named Kreth Valor, bored, curious, with nothing else to do during a 12-hour drift survey, tuned in. I know what Kreth Valor saw because he later testified to it at the Hegemony Council hearing, and his testimony was recorded and is part of the public archive. I'm going to tell you his account in his own words, as close as I can reconstruct them, because his words are better than mine for this part. I was expecting it to be interference, Kreth said. The signal had the signature profile of a malfunctioning relay beacon. My first instinct was to log it as ambient noise and move on. But the modulation pattern was wrong for equipment failure. It was too regular. So I ran a signal analysis and it came back as structured data, broadcast standard, encoded in a compression format I didn't recognize. I ran it through the universal translation matrix. It flagged as partially translatable. About 60% of the linguistic content was decodable with existing databases. The visual content required no translation. The first image that resolved on my screen was a sunrise. He paused at that point in his testimony. The council chamber was quiet. Over water, he continued. A large body of open water. I later learned it was an ocean. Earth has several. They cover about 70% of the planet's surface. The sun was rising through clouds, and the light was. He stopped again. I want to be precise about this, he said, because I am aware of how this sounds. I am a trained sensor operator. I am not given to anthropomorphic projection. But the light was beautiful. I don't know how else to say it. It was genuinely, simply beautiful in a way that required no translation. I watched for approximately 4 minutes before I thought to record it. Kreth Valor was on duty for another 9 hours that day. He watched the Earth channel for most of them. He later described it to colleagues as falling into something he didn't have a word for, which, when the translation matrix processed it, came out closest to the hegemony common term for a state of absorbed wondering that children experience and most adults forget. He downloaded everything he could. He filed his drift survey as routine. He went back to his bunk and watched more. The content he downloaded included the Nairobi market footage. It included the fishing village. It included the bicycle learning and the chess players and the teenagers arguing about music. It included 27 separate episodes of something the translation matrix identified as a documentary series about humans cooking food for each other, which Kreth found baffling and then, somehow, deeply moving. It included footage of a human emergency response team pulling survivors from a collapsed structure, slow and methodical, not stopping, not speeding up, just continuing in a way that Kreth said made him feel something he couldn't name in any language he knew. It included a recording of a human woman sitting in a hospital room, holding the hand of another human who appeared to be at the end of their life, and just staying there. Not speaking, just staying. Kreth watched that one 3 times. He made copies of everything. When the survey vessel returned to port 4 days later, he sent copies to 7 people he trusted with a message that said, approximately, "I found something. I don't know what to do with it. Watch." Within 2 weeks, the Earth channel was circulating through hegemony crew networks at a rate that I can only describe as viral, which is actually a human term that turned out to be perfect for the phenomenon. Something small, replicating itself, spreading through systems in ways that no one planned or authorized. The species who watched it responded differently, as you'd expect. The Varesi, who are analytical by nature and approach everything as a classification problem, began cataloging the human behaviors displayed in the footage with a thoroughness that they described as scientifically urgent. Their academic networks lit up with debate about human psychological architecture, their extraordinary range of emotional expression, and a particular paper that got widely circulated arguing that the cooking documentary series represented the most efficient recorded mechanism for expressing social bonding patterns across cultural divisions. The Sethali responded with something that doesn't translate well, but is closest to grief, which seems counterintuitive until you understand that Sethali grief is not sorrow for loss, but sorrow for not having known something sooner. They had never encountered humans. They watched the footage and felt, collectively, the weight of 40 years of that sunrise going unseen. The Druvani, and this is the one that still gets to me, even now. The Druvani watched the footage of the emergency response team, the one where the humans pulled survivors from the rubble without stopping, and their consensus assembly issued a formal statement that read, in part, "We have observed a species whose persistence in the face of entropy is structurally analogous to a fundamental principle we consider sacred. We do not have a word in common for what we feel upon this recognition. We are working on developing one." The hegemony administrative apparatus, predictably, did not watch the footage for 2 more weeks, because administrative apparatuses do not watch things until someone makes watching things part of their required procedure. But the beings who worked in the apparatus watched it, and that made a difference. I watched it on the 19th day of the human stay in Waiting Hall 7C. Kreth Valor's copies had made their way, by then, into the general crew and staff network of the processing station. Someone had posted a link in the staff common room terminal. I found it during my lunch break. I watched for 40 minutes. I had to stop and go back to work. I sat at my intake desk and looked at Amara Osai writing in her notebook, and Kweku Asant in his stillness, and the large man Petrov who never complained about the chairs, and young Yim with her folded paper shapes, and old Hassan who shared his food, and the other 5 humans I had learned the names of over 19 days. I thought about the sunrise over the water. I thought about the woman who stayed in the hospital room. I pulled up the human's application file on my terminal. 11 rejections, the most recent 7 months ago. Reason, insufficient sponsor certification. I looked at the list of species currently in the waiting hall. I looked at Veshar Kai, the Druvani elder, sitting in his now properly lit corner, filling out resettlement forms with the steady focus of a being who had recently been reminded that the rules could work in his favor. I thought about something for a while. Then I opened a rarely used provision in the hegemony processing code that I had looked up once, 2 years ago, out of curiosity, and never had occasion to use. It was called Provisional Cross-Species Advocacy, and it allowed for a pending species application to be forwarded for emergency review if 3 or more registered applicants from different existing species submitted a joint attestation of relevance. It was not the same as sponsor certification. It was a much lower bar. It had been designed for exactly the kind of procedural gap that the humans had been falling into. But it required the 3 registered applicants to independently and voluntarily submit the attestation. I could not ask them to do it. That would compromise the process. I could not tell the humans about the provision. That would compromise the process. I could print the regulation on a standard information sheet and place it in the publicly available resource rack near the queue board. I did that. I placed it 3rd from the left, between a guide to Druvani resettlement documentation and an overview of Sethali dietary exemption requests. Then I went back to my desk. I don't know exactly what happened next, because I was at my desk and the resource rack was across the room, and I am not permitted to surveil applicants. But based on the sequence of events, here is what I believe occurred. Amara Osai noticed the new sheet in the rack. She was, by that point, extremely familiar with that rack and what was in it, because she had read everything in it multiple times. She read the sheet. She sat with it for a while. Then she put it back, very carefully, in the third from left position. Sometime in the next hour, she said something to Kweku Asant, and then something to Hassan, and then something to Yim, who stopped folding paper and listened with unusual stillness. I don't know what she said. Within 2 hours, Vesharkai came to my desk. "I would like to submit an attestation," he said. I gave him the form. An hour after that, a Sethali applicant named Esenthar came to my desk. She had been in the hall for 31 days waiting for a nutritional exemption review. She submitted an attestation. The third came on the following morning. A Varesi academic named Torithvel, who had been waiting for conference accreditation for 6 weeks, submitted the third attestation. The 3 attestations were from different registered species. They met every requirement of provisional cross-species advocacy. I forwarded the human application for emergency review at 9:42 station time. Part 3, the hearing. The emergency review was not, technically, supposed to be fast. But something strange was happening at Hegemony Central Command by that point, because the Earth Channel had reached the upper administrative networks, and people were talking. I say people because that's what they were. Varesi, Sethali, Druvani, Korathi, all the other species who made up the apparatus of the hegemony. They were all people, and they had all by then been watching the footage that Kreth Valor had found orbiting quietly in the drift, and they were feeling things that bureaucratic structures tend to suppress, and that were proving, in this instance, unexpectedly difficult to suppress. The emergency review was granted. A hearing date was set for 42 days out. Amara Osai received the notification on her communicator while she was in the middle of the waiting hall, and I watched her face do something complicated. Relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been the human expression for finally, though I couldn't be certain. And then she pressed both hands flat against her thighs the way she sometimes did when she was composing herself, and she told the others. There was a moment. I cannot fully describe the moment. I can say that Petrov, the large, quiet man, made a sound that was completely unlike anything I had heard from a human being before, and then immediately looked embarrassed about it. I can say that young Yim threw her arms around Amara in a way that was clearly automatic, and then pulled back slightly with a look that suggested she was checking whether that was appropriate, and Amara's expression said yes, unambiguously yes. I can say that Hassan sat very still with his eyes closed for a moment. I can say that Kweku Asant looked directly at me from across the room, and I looked away because I was an intake clerk and I was not supposed to be emotionally involved in application outcomes. I was quite manifestly emotionally involved in application outcomes. The hearing itself took place at Hegemony Council Station, which was a different facility from the processing annex, larger, more formal, with lighting calibrated for the Varesi dignitaries who made up the majority of the council. Amara Osai and Kweku Asant attended as representatives of the United Earth Diplomatic Mission. The remaining 7 humans returned to Earth to wait. I was not at the hearing. I heard about it afterward from people who were, and from the official record, which is public. The hearing lasted 4 days. The first 3 were procedural: documentation review, regulatory compliance assessment, the standard machinery of hegemony administrative process. The humans had brought every document that had ever been requested of them, in hegemony common script, organized with a thoroughness that one council member later described as humbling, given the circumstances. The 4th day was when something unprecedented happened. Council hearings do not include testimony from non-party observers. They are closed, formal, procedurally rigid. These are features of the process that have existed for 400 years. On the morning of the 4th day, the council chamber received, through official channels, a formal joint statement. It had been signed by representatives of 14 separate hegemony member species. It cited the provisional cross-species advocacy attestations. It cited specific observed behaviors and the Earth Channel footage. It cited the Druvani elder Vesharkai by name and the Sethali applicant Essenthar and the Veresi academic Torithvel. It cited Kreth Valor and his drift survey. The statement said, in part, "We have observed, across our separate and independent encounters with the human species, a consistency of characteristic behavior that we believe the Council record should formally note. These characteristics include the extension of aid without calculation of return, the persistence of effort in the absence of acknowledgement, the maintenance of dignity on behalf of others at personal cost, and the capacity to remain fully present to another being's experience, including experiences of loss and ending, without diminishment or retreat. We do not cite these characteristics as arguments that humans are superior. We cite them because the record of this council has not previously contained them, and we believe the record should be complete." The statement was not legally binding. It was not part of the official evidence. The council was under no procedural obligation to consider it. The council chairperson, a Veresi elder named Sithkale, read it into the official record anyway. What happened at the end of the fourth day was this. The council voted on the human application for observer status. The vote was 11-2 in favor. The two opposed cited procedural concerns about the irregular advocacy process. They were not wrong that the process had been irregular. They were right procedurally that provisional cross-species advocacy was an unusual mechanism. They were right that the human case had moved through the system in a way that deviated from standard practice. Sithkale, in her official summation, acknowledged all of this. And then she said something that I have read many times since, because it was included in the public record, and I want to make sure I have it right. This council has reviewed the applications of 47 species. In 46 cases, we relied on standard mechanisms developed over 4 centuries to assess whether a species was ready to take its place in this community. In the case of the 47th species, we relied on those mechanisms, found them insufficient, and then found ourselves supplemented, not by those species' own advocates, but by species who had nothing procedural to gain from speaking on their behalf. I think the Council should sit with that for a moment. The procedures exist to protect the integrity of this community. They are not the community itself. The community is what the procedures are trying to protect. And the fact that 14 species felt moved to speak, not required to, not incentivized to, but simply moved, says something about what this community might become with the 47th species in it. Vote recorded. Humans observer status granted. Part 4. What came after? The official notification reached Amara Osai's communicator at 14:17 Council Station time. I know this because she called Kweku Asant the moment it came through, and Kweku Asant apparently made the same kind of sound that Petrov had made in the waiting hall, which caused a Veresi delegate passing in the corridor outside the chamber to stop, look through the door, and determine that nothing was medically wrong, because the sound was outside the Veresi register of distress calls. The delegate later told a colleague that he had never heard anything quite like it, and that it had been, despite its alien quality, unmistakably a sound of something good. Amara sent a transmission to Earth. I don't have the full text of that transmission. The parts that made it into the public record are fragments, and I will not reproduce them here because they are private, in the way that some moments should remain private even when history is watching. But I will tell you that the fragments indicate a lot of people on Earth received the message, and a lot of people on Earth cried, and the crying was captured on local media feeds and rebroadcast widely. And when the Sethali Academic Network picked up those feeds, they experienced another wave of what they called anticipatory grief, and wrote 17 papers about it. On Earth, apparently, they put the sunrise footage on public screens in a lot of cities, not to announce anything official, just because someone thought it was the right thing to do. Back at Waiting Hall 7C, the days after the hearing were different. Vesharkai's resettlement claim was resolved 12 days later. The resolution came through proper channels, triggered by a review I had quietly flagged after updating the facility's standard operating procedures. He was allocated to a settlement on a world that had the right light spectrum for Druvani sensory clusters. When he received the notification, he stood in the middle of the hall for a long moment. Then he came to my desk. He placed on the counter a small object, a carved fragment of mineral, warm-colored, smooth-edged, the kind of thing that takes a long time to make by hand. He said in Hegemony Common that in Druvani tradition, a thing made by hand is a suitable gift for someone who made a thing possible, and that he wanted me to have it. I said I couldn't accept gifts from applicants. He said it was not a gift. It was a record. It was a Druvani practice to leave a carved record in places where something important happened, so the place would remember. I accepted it. I put it on my desk. It's still there. I still have it. Senthar, the Sethali applicant, received her nutritional exemption approval 17 days after the hearing. She came and told me when it happened, which was unusual. Applicants generally just left when their business was concluded. She sat in one of the wrong-shaped chairs and told me that she intended to learn more about the humans, and that she had begun watching the Earth Channel in her berth every evening, and that the cooking documentary series was the most important thing she had ever watched, and she was aware that this was a large claim. I told her I agreed with the claim. She looked at me with the three-eyed directness that Sethali use when they want to be seen clearly. "You put the regulation sheet in the rack," she said. I said I put many regulation sheets in the rack. "Third from left," she said, "between Druvani and Sethali, where everyone could reach it." I said I didn't know what she was referring to. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she did something with her facial membranes that my translation instinct said was the equivalent of a knowing smile, and she stood and left. Torithvel, the Varesi academic, sent me a message 3 weeks after the hearing. Academic Varesi communicate via formal written message. It's a cultural convention, and the message was long and precisely worded and contained several paragraphs of citation to his own previous work, as Varesi academics are prone to do. But the core of it was simple. He wrote that he had been asked to present a paper at the upcoming Hegemony Cultural Studies Conference on the subject of trans-species compassionate recognition, and that he planned to title it The Earth Channel and the Anatomy of Being Seen. He asked if he could cite my observations from Waiting Hall 7C as part of his research. I wrote back and said I was not sure my observations were of academic value. He replied the following day with a message that was even longer and more precisely worded and said, in essence, "You made the regulation available. You adjusted the lighting. You flagged the resettlement claim. You forwarded the application. None of those actions were required of you. All of them made something possible. The study of how beings choose to make things possible is exactly what my paper is about, and I am asking your permission to include you in it." I gave my permission. The paper was presented. It circulated widely in the academic network. It was, as far as I know, the first formal hegemony academic work to argue that the standard procedures for species integration had a structural blind spot, a tendency to assess capability while failing to assess character, and that the human case had revealed this blind spot in a way that the Council and the hegemony at large should study. It was not the last such paper. Part 5, The Humans Themselves. I want to tell you about the humans themselves, because I think this part of the story gets lost in the bigger picture. Amara Osai went back to Earth after the hearing and spent the next year preparing the formal application for full member status, a much longer process than observer status, with its own set of requirements. She was methodical and patient and thorough, and she brought with her the same quality of attention she had brought to Waiting Hall 7C. The capacity to look at a complicated system and understand its actual structure, not the structure it claimed to have. She made the application 4 years later. It was approved. She is currently serving as Earth's first full diplomatic representative to the Hegemony Council. She still carries a notebook. She still uses a physical pen. She told an interviewer once that she found physical writing useful because it forced her to commit to what she was thinking in a way that digital tools didn't quite replicate. The interviewer asked her what she was usually thinking about. She said, how to make things possible for people who don't know yet that they're possible. Kwekuasant returned to Earth briefly after the hearing, and then came back to the Hegemony, where he took up a post in the New Earth Observer Mission offices. He specialized, in subsequent years, in what became known as cross-species advocacy architecture, the development of formal mechanisms for ensuring that new species applications didn't fall into the procedural gaps that Earth's applications had fallen into for 43 years. He once said in an interview that he thought of it as plumbing work. People think of diplomatic architecture as something grand, he said, but most of what breaks things is leaks. Small places where the pressure is wrong and things don't flow the way they should. You find the leak, you fix the leak, you move to the next leak. He was asked if he found the work rewarding. I find it necessary, he said. That's usually enough. The woman named Yim, who folded paper shapes, became something of a minor cultural phenomenon across several species when footage of her habit, circulating through the same networks as the Earth Channel, prompted widespread fascination with the human practice of origami. There are currently 4 academic papers on origami as a cross-species communication tool, all of which cite her without her knowledge, because she's not particularly interested in being cited and has never read them. She is currently working as an engineer on the Earth Hegemony Joint Infrastructure Project, and still folds paper when she's thinking. Old Hassan, who shared his food, passed away 2 years after the hearing, on Earth, in his own home, surrounded by family. I know this because Kweku Asante sent me a notification, which I found both unexpected and completely appropriate. The notification said Hassan had asked to be remembered as someone who fed people when they were hungry, and that this had seemed to him sufficient. It seemed sufficient to me too. Petrov, the large, quiet man, I lost track of. He didn't stay in the diplomatic service. I heard through various channels that he had gone back to doing something with engineering somewhere in the outer systems. Some people do the hard part and then hand it to someone else and go back to their actual work. That's its own kind of service. Part 6, the channel. I want to come back to the channel because I don't think I've fully conveyed what it was. After the human application was approved, the Earth Channel became a subject of study in its own right. Hegemony xenocultural researchers spent years cataloging and analyzing its content. They produced papers, symposia, an entire academic subdiscipline that persists to this day. But the thing that none of the papers quite captures, and I've read most of them, is the texture of the thing, the dailiness of it. The Earth Channel was not a curated highlight reel. It was not humanity at its most impressive or its most heroic. It included footage of people failing at things and then trying again. It included arguments, misunderstandings, awkward silences. It included a remarkable amount of humans laughing at themselves. It included a documentary about a single tree in a city. Not a famous tree, just a tree that had been in the same spot for 150 years and had become part of the neighborhood around it. And the documentary was 90 minutes long and featured, among others, a retired postal worker who brought the tree water during droughts because, as he put it, "It's been here longer than I have, and it doesn't have anywhere to go." The documentary about the tree was not an allegory. The retired postal worker was not making a philosophical statement. He was just watering a tree. That's the thing. That's the thing the papers keep almost getting to and then sliding past. The humans weren't performing. The channel caught them not performing, and somehow that was the most extraordinary thing in it. A Druvani cultural philosopher named Errol Kai, who is, I should mention, Veshar Kai's granddaughter, wrote what I consider to be the best single description of the Earth Channel's effect. She wrote, "Most civilizations, when they attempt first contact, present themselves. The humans, by accident or by wisdom I cannot determine, allowed themselves to be witnessed. These are different things. A presentation is a performance of identity. A witnessing is an encounter with reality." We had been, without knowing it, hungry for a reality that was not our own. The Earth Channel fed us. I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. Epilogue, the intake desk. I am writing this document 11 years after Amara Osai first placed her paper documents on my intake desk. I have been promoted 3 times since then. I am now the Director of Applicant Services for the Outer Processing Network, which means I no longer sit at an intake desk myself, though I visit the intake desks regularly, because I think the people who sit at them are doing the most important work in the facility, and they should know that someone is paying attention. Waiting Hall 7C has been redesigned. The chairs are now adjustable for multiple species anatomies. The lighting has 4 zone settings, each optimized for a different set of physiological requirements, and the system now automatically runs a species assessment at intake and adjusts accordingly. The environmental processors have been fully replaced, a new contract, properly filed, executed on time, and the air in the hall has, if not a pleasant personality, at least an inoffensive one. The queue wait times are still long. That's something we're working on. On my desk, my director's desk now in a larger office with windows, I have three things. I have a framed copy of Errol Kai's quote. I have a small folded paper crane that Yim made in the waiting room and left behind accidentally and that I kept, which I tell myself is archival preservation, and which is actually just something I wanted to keep. And I have Veshar Kai's carved mineral fragment, the warm-colored, smooth-edged record he said would help the place remember. The place where the mineral fragment sits is not waiting Hall 7C anymore, but I think it still counts. I think the remembering travels. I sometimes think about that sunrise footage, the image that hit Kreth Valor's screen in the middle of a drift survey and stopped him for 4 minutes. I've watched it many times now, as has most of the known galaxy. It has been reproduced in art installations and academic presentations, and in one memorable instance, projected across the face of a hegemony council building during a diplomatic reception, which was unauthorized and caused a minor procedural incident and was entirely worth it. I think about the fact that it was out there for 40 years, broadcasting into the dark, and nobody heard it. I think about the 11 rejections, the paperwork, the procedural gaps, the 43 years of a species knocking on a door that was never technically locked but whose mechanism no one had explained. I think about Amara Osai in the wrong-shaped chair, writing in her notebook, learning everyone's name. I think about the woman in the hospital room, just staying. I think about what Errol Kai wrote, that most civilizations present themselves and the humans allowed themselves to be witnessed. And I think there's something else in there, something she didn't quite say but that I have been thinking about for 11 years. The humans didn't just allow themselves to be witnessed. They kept showing up to be witnessed, even when no one was watching. They sent their channel into the dark and let it run. They filed their applications and corrected the deficiencies and filed again. They came to a waiting room where no one expected them and learned everyone's name and adjusted the lighting and put the sheet in the rack and waited. They kept showing up. Not because they were sure it would work. Not because the procedures had been fair to them or the system had been designed with them in mind. They kept showing up because, and I am aware this is my interpretation, and I am not human, and I might have this wrong, because that's what they did. Because they had decided that the thing on the other side of the door was worth the showing up. There is a human word I learned in my first year of studying their language, after the Earth Channel came to my attention. The word is perseverance, and the translation matrix renders it as continuing in the face of difficulty, which is accurate but doesn't capture the texture of it. In the original English, the word has a quality of choosing to continue, not being dragged forward, not being mechanically incapable of stopping, but making an active, repeated decision to keep going. Perseverance. That's what the relay buoy broadcast for 40 years, into a section of space where no one was listening. That's what Amara Osai's paper documents said when she put them on my desk. That's what 11 rejections, each corrected and reapplied, said about the kind of species Earth was sending out to represent itself. And I think that's what the channel was, really, underneath all the footage and the sunrises and the cooking shows and the old men playing chess and the woman who stayed in the room and the man who watered the tree. It was a record of beings who had decided, in 1,000 different ordinary ways, that showing up for each other was the point. That it had always been the point. That even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching, it was worth doing anyway.